So thanks so much, and hi everybody, and it's great to see all of you, and it's great to be back in Calgary again. This is, I think, my third trip out here, and see a lot of friends and some clients here as well. So it's great to have that welcome. Also, thanks for the warm welcome from the UK. Actually, our firm once upon a time was called New Energy Finance, and it was started 15 years ago in London in a little walk-up apartment. And back then, nobody knew anything about clean energy as anything other than basically kind of a social experiment. And our role in life was to try to become the smartest kids on the block in terms of researching the economics behind it. And thankfully, at the time, nobody else was doing that. So that's sort of how we got our start in life, and that was as a London company, actually. And then we sold the company in 2009 to Bloomberg, and now we're known as Bloomberg NEF, and that's how I got here today. Let me see if this actually works. Let me kick it off here. Great, so just very quickly, the advertising slides. This is who we are. There are a couple hundred of us in these offices around the world. As David mentioned, my team is in the Americas. And Brazil actually is a really interesting market for a lot of reasons. It used to be very interesting in terms of ethanol. Now we view it as very interesting in terms of potentially for gas, but also in terms of renewables. And so I do get down there a fair amount. These are some of our clients. I would say we began life serving primarily those in the financial sector. Those were the ones who were willing to pay for information about a new industry. Over time, the client list is widened to include those who are primarily in the world of oil and gas and power and utilities, those who are involved in actually generating energy, and governments ultimately as well. I won't walk you through all of this. Okay, so one last thing I would say about us before I start, which is that we began life as a renewable energy research firm, but over time we've covered a lot more areas, and increasingly we actually do focus a lot on LNG and gas research. We're doing a little bit of research around oil. There are plenty of other great firms that do that, so it's not a space that we've gotten into quite as much. But we're focusing on materials, Internet of Things, digital technologies, anything that we see that essentially is now critical in what we view as a larger long-term transformation that we think is very much underway in energy. So I will show you a lot of charts and pictures, and hopefully those will be useful, but if there's nothing else, I sort of want to impart to you some very basic points before I start. So first, our view, and this is the thesis behind our firm and why I'm here today, is we believe that how the world generates, consumes, and delivers energy are all changing rapidly and radically. Very, very big changes we've seen over the last 10 years and a lot more to come. So A, big changes are afoot. B, these changes, in our view, are fundamental in terms of the implications that they have for incumbent players. And it creates a number of challenges, but I would say a number of opportunities as well. But change isn't always easy, as all of you know, and so it's creating some discomfort. The third thing is it's creating new business models and opportunities to exploit these opportunities and address the challenges. And a lot of new companies and new players are getting into energy in ways that we've never seen before. Companies like Google, that you would not have thought is an energy player, but now makes high-tech thermostats that people use in their homes. Other companies as well are moving rapidly into this space as well. Your cable company, others as well. There's serious investment being deployed in this area and to further improve how energy is generated, consumed, and delivered. And I'll talk a little bit about the capital flows. There's nothing alternative about these new energy technologies at all anymore. I'll talk a little bit about why that is. And then finally, our general view is that there's really more change that's just inevitable. And I was trying to make this point when I speak, which is that I think the most risky bet you can make right now is to assume that there will be the status quo 10 or 20 years from now. The amount of change that we've already seen just in the last 10 years has been incredibly dramatic, particularly in the power sector in the US and other places. I know it's been a little slower moving here, but you've seen changes here as well. It's been really fundamental. And if you look at where these technologies are going and the way things are going to change, it is not safe to assume that where you're sitting today is where you're going to be sitting 10 years from now. There will be enough change that everything will be disrupted in a fundamental way. All right, so here are some of the areas that I'm going to cover. I'll talk a little bit about investment. I'm going to talk about consumers and the opportunities that they have. Talk about batteries and why I think they're sexy. You may not agree, but I think they are. You're going to talk about electric vehicles. And then finally, I want to put a little bit of context around this in terms of climate change. So first, just talking about clean energy investment. We've been clicking along somewhere around $300 billion a year of new investment in clean energy technologies for the last 5, 6, 7 years at this point. Since our firm was founded, we've counted well over $2 trillion of new capital that's gone into this sector. Now, it's always worth stopping and saying, what do I mean? What am I talking about here about clean energy? And like I said, our firm we do research about nuclear, we do research about gas and other things as well. But in this context, I have a pretty narrow definition, which is wind, solar, geothermal, biomass, sort of the most narrowly defined definition of renewables, including hydro, but only small hydro in this particular case. And then I'm talking about biofuels, and I'm talking about electric vehicles and batteries. That's it. Just even that narrow category. We're still talking about $300 billion a year in new capital that's going in year on year. And most of it, the majority of it goes to building kit. So large-scale wind farms, large-scale solar projects, residential solar, behind-the-meter solar for small commercial businesses. That's where most of that money goes. And if you'll see, for those in the cheap seats in the back, I'll sort of try and explain some of these slides. Red is APAC, the Asia-Pacific region. And you can see that this used to be a story mostly of Europe and the US, but over the last 5, 10 years, really Asia and really China have accounted for a huge portion of what's gone on in terms of investment in this sector. And the same can be reflected in the amount of actual capacity that gets built. So of the 160 gigawatts or so that were built last year, you can see that red chunk is the Asia-Pacific region, and I would say about 2/3 or more of that is China specifically. So China has been the leading market both on the manufacturing side, particularly for solar, but also on the demand side. And of course, we always think of China as a rapidly growing economy. We think about their emissions, CO2 emissions surging. Their demand for gas is rising. We hear nat gas is rising as well. They're building a lot of coal. They're building a lot of nuclear, building a lot of everything. They're building a lot of renewables, too. And they're also doing a lot of stuff, interesting stuff in electric transportation, which I'll talk about in just a few minutes. So what's been driving that, of course, is the fact that we are seeing a real decline in costs. This is just one of the many ways you can look at the costs of solar. Again, for those in the back, the red line at the very bottom is the cost of an actual photovoltaic module as you might buy it at the factory gate in China. When I started working at this company, and then about 10 years ago, the cost of a module was maybe $7 or $8 a watt. It's going to be about 25 cents a watt by the end of this year. The cost declines have been spectacular. Some of it is, there's certainly been some technological improvements, but the main reason is just scale. The sheer volume of capacity that's been added in China in particular, but other parts of the world has driven down that underlying equipment cost. The lines above show you the cost of actually installing solar at the residential level in different markets. Without going into too many details, I'll just say is that there are big differences depending on what part of the world you are in terms of how much has actually gotten built to date, how much capacity has come online in terms of achieving scale. But in all cases, the costs have been declining. And again, on the right-hand side, you can just see the total volume of actual capacity that's been built around solar year to year. Wind is a little different story. I'll show you in a second, but it's not quite the sort of up story that we've seen with solar, but nonetheless, we're talking about over 100 gigawatts in the case of solar around the world that's been added. Wind, somewhat similar story. Technological improvements in terms of volume have, manufacturing capacity expansion has essentially allowed for a decline in the prices. That's something on the left-hand side. We track the price of wind turbines by surveying the buyers and the sellers, and you can see how the prices have come down. Not that same similar kind of decline rate that we've seen for solar by any means, Part of it is because we're talking about giant pieces of kit, all kinds of input, steel and copper and other things that go into a turbine. There's only so much you can drive the costs out of those, but those costs have been declining on a megawatt basis. But more important for solar, really, and particularly in the context of a place up here like Alberta, where I know there are a number of projects that are under development at the moment, has been that the capacity factors, the output per turbine has been rising really quite spectacularly. And, you know, long story short on this, and one of the reasons why this has come to be is that essentially at a certain point, developers were building wind farms in the sort of super, super windy places, and then they were saying, okay, well, in some markets like Germany and the US, okay, we got to find lower wind speed places where we can build wind farms as well. And then they went to those places and they said, okay, well, we want to scoop up more of the wind in those locations, so let's build longer blades. So they did, and that helped essentially increase the yields in those locations. And then they said, oh, wait a second, why don't we try these longer blades in the higher speed winds? Hopefully they won't get, you know, destroyed. And they haven't. And that has allowed essentially much higher yields. It used to be in the US, you know, we would take maybe 25, 30%, and up here as well as a common capacity factor on wind. Now we regularly see wind farms 35, 40%. The ones that I've seen, I went to one in Oklahoma that's achieving over 50%. Some of the places in Brazil well over 50% as well. So the output of these projects is getting much, much higher, which is definitely helping the economics of wind. And you've seen that really here in the context of Alberta. There was an auction held, very low price for wind was bid in, I think it was $37 per megawatt hour was what essentially was agreed. As I said earlier, you know, one thing worth sort of keeping in context is that this stuff is not alternative anymore. It's a small point, but when you're talking about a majority of the capital in any given year going into these, you know, technologies, if you include large hydro and nuclear, the majority of money that's being invested in any given year now to build new power generation is zero carbon, actually, if you include those categories. So it's not really that clean energy or zero carbon energy is alternative at this point. The other thing is, in terms of who's putting the money in, we were talking about this a little bit before I came up here, is that for a while, this technology was viewed as risky. For a long time, it was viewed as risky. No one knew what was the output going to be? Have you deployed wind in that regime, et cetera, et cetera. Investors have generally gotten very comfortable with the technology risks associated with wind and solar. Maybe a little less so with geothermal, but for the first two, they generally get it at this point. And in fact, if anything, the fact that there is no fuel price input in these, because they are entirely, the fuel is the wind and the sun, which you have a zero marginal cost, basically, in terms of our operating, they're actually viewed as pretty low costs. So we've seen as this trend towards green bonds in terms of the amount of new capital that's coming in to finance clean energy, other things that are being defined as green as well, but in particular, refinancing of existing wind and solar projects by large institutional investors who are willing to frankly accept a little bit lower rates of return than a developer or a private equity fund that would have initially funded some of these projects. And that, we've seen this in different types of bonds that have been issued. That's on the left side. On the right, you can see the regional split. This will be another record year for green bond activity. And again, what I like to say is that, for a long time, the clean energy sector has essentially not been funded in the same way that oil and gas has. It's mostly been private transactions. It's mostly been, literally thousands of little deals. And it's been expensive, frankly, from a financing perspective. So when you see this kind of capital come in to kind of take out some of the preliminary financing, it's a very positive sign for the sector that you can drive down the cost of capital longer term. Okay, so that hopefully gives a bit of a sense as to sort of where we are overall in terms of the total amount of capital that's been deployed. The second sort of big trend I kind of want to talk about today is what we call the empowered consumer. Long story short is that not that long ago, if you think about the decisions you make as a consumer around how you got yourself from point A to B, about how you might put fuel in your car, about how you got electricity in your home, those decisions were pretty narrow. You bought your juice from the utility. You probably put gasoline in your tank. Maybe you had a diesel vehicle. And in terms of understanding, in fact, and then in terms of getting from point A to B, if you didn't have a car, you took a cab. You think about how much change there's been in all of these different types of ways, certainly with the rise of Uber and Lyft and all these other services, or where I live in Washington, where you have scooters and bike shares and any other variety of ways for this sort of short haul transportation. And then you think about it as a utility consumer, you can, in many regimes, you can choose to buy green power if you want. You can understand your energy use much better through digital thermostats. You can, in some competitive markets, choose who the retailer is who provides you that electricity. You could put a solar system on your roof if you're interested. And then finally, in terms of your vehicle that you own, well, you could obviously put gasoline still in your car, which is what most people do, but you could choose to have a hybrid car or an electric car. You could even choose ethanol if that's what you're into. There are a lot more choices for consumers. And I guess before I embark on this conversation, I would sort of note that those are not necessarily choices that most people are interested in if they don't pay a lot for energy. The more your energy bills go up, whether it's gasoline or electricity, the more compelled and interested you get as a consumer. But there's a lot of different ways to define consumers, so I want to talk a little bit about those. First, just to talk about residential photovoltaics. In Australia, about 1 in 5 homes has PV on its roof now. Look, Australia is a unique case of high power prices and lots of sun, and very motivated consumers as a result. But it is kind of an interesting sort of postcard from the future because, you know, PV, this happened when photovoltaic prices were a lot higher than they are now. And in this newer world, it could be a lot of other places that you start to see. In the US, and I imagine here as well, a lot of the adoption so far around PV on people's roofs has been people who live in places like Palo Alto or Beverly Hills who are sort of inclined socially to do this. Not so in Australia. You have pensioners, you have folks all across the economic spectrum who are doing solar because it just works for them, essentially. So you see that level of penetration so far in a market like that. Less so in other markets. We're at about 1% in the US so far. Canada's lower than that, I know, as well. Looking ahead, on the right-hand side, though, our view is that decentralization is an inevitable trend that we're going to see more and more of going forward. More and more you're going to see the move off of the grid, not necessarily literally entirely, not literally people who disconnect from the grid completely, but people who buy some higher percentage of the power from their PV system, more likely, maybe a distributed wind project, but more likely from PV on the roof, and maybe pairing it with a battery at some point in the future. As I mentioned, the other area where consumers have choices now is around vehicles. And if this works right, you'll kind of see the progression of all the electric vehicles that have been offered year on year on year on year going forward. You know, there was a time when the only thing you could drive that was an electric vehicle was something that basically was a glorified, you know, golf cart. And then, of course, we had the Tesla, you know, Roadster, which was at the exact opposite end, over $100,000, this incredible car that nobody could afford. And now we're starting to finally see a proliferation of cars that a middle-class person can at least come closer to actually affording. And I'll talk a little bit more about the economics of electric vehicles in just a moment. But I will just say one thing about EVs, which is that from a consumer experience, I just would suggest anybody in the room who has not driven an electric vehicle, go drive one. Even frankly, a fairly modest Nissan Leaf or something like that. The consumer experience of driving these vehicles is, I would argue, generally superior. The cars are very, very quiet. The acceleration, even again, not on a Tesla, but on some of these other cars, is spectacular. And there are issues around range. I'll talk a little bit about that in just a minute. But from a consumer's perspective, the use of these cars is very, very pleasing. And that will ultimately have some, I really do believe, have some impact beyond the economics. And I'll talk about the economics in a second. But the consumer's got a lot more choices in transportation. And you can see all these additional cars that have come on the market or are coming on the market. The other type of consumer worth noting, which, and of course I've been defining consumer in this conversation as you and me and the retail customer, but corporates obviously buy a tremendous amount of electricity. And one of the more interesting developments that we've seen in recent years has been the move towards proactive purchase of clean energy by large corporations. There are 150 companies now on something called the RE100. These are companies that are pledging to power all their operations from clean energy. This includes some of the biggest companies in the world. You can see on this chart here, Alphabet, which owns Google, Microsoft, others. Been sort of the biggest names that you may have read about, but it's not just a West Coast technology thing anymore. There's certainly a lot of other Fortune 500 companies that are now on this list as well. And this just plots the total pledges or the amount of actual clean energy that they've bought, on the left-hand axis, versus what their total demand is. So some of these guys have some pretty serious demand. What's not on the chart and has made a commitment is Walmart. We couldn't even fit them on the chart. They're too far to the right in terms of the amount of energy demand that they've got. But if you total up all of this demand that's created by these pledges that these companies have made, it's somewhere a bit more than the total demand of, say, the Netherlands. So it's considerable. It's not massive, but it's a real choice that these companies are making. Some are buying green certificates, some are building plants on their property, some are signing other types of contracts as well. In particular, for those who are developers maybe in the room, the main opportunity for the development community has been these power purchase agreements. And this year so far, we've seen 8.5 gigawatts worth of PPAs that have been signed by corporates specifically to buy wind and solar generating capacity. All right, so I'll talk a little bit about batteries. I mean, and of course, that's all well and good. Everything I just talked about, these technologies, they generate a lot, and usually the first question I would get after showing all that stuff is, yeah, but what if the wind's not blowing? Or what if the sun's not shining? These are perfectly fair questions. If you look at the demand, if you look at the output profiles of these technologies, they essentially don't, obviously they don't generate when they don't have the natural resource available to them. So the question is, can they be integrated into the grid in a meaningful way that allows us to continue to keep the lights on all the time? When we first started our firm, look, wind and solar were so on the margins that just didn't matter. You just focused on whether you could build a little bit here or there, you get 1 or 2% penetration. You start to get up around 30, 40% penetration in places like Germany and elsewhere. It has real fundamental implications for how you run your grid. Somewhat on the technical side, but much more, I would argue, on the economic side in terms of the existing players and how they're affected by the proliferation of zero carbon and zero marginal cost generation entering. So batteries are critical. We've always thought they were important. They're more important than ever. And for those who are not battery or power sector people, just at a very high level, these are just sort of 3 examples of how batteries help on the grid. First, you're looking in the very, very short-term range of things. On a seconds basis, they can help to control frequency in the very, very short run. Things that we don't even see every day. It flickers in terms of generation that comes from other plants that need to be on an instantaneous basis met by some supply of demand. The second is on a day or day-ahead basis, on a continuous balancing basis, that you can see batteries trying to help meet that need going forward. And then third, on a much longer term, sort of years to months ahead basis. And this is probably the most challenging part for any battery, but other storage technologies like pumped hydro and others can help to address that going forward. So these are just 3 potential or current kind of uses. Now, we have technologies that address these things now. In particular, when you talk about something like frequency regulation, a gas plant can fire up and fire down to help address that need. And a colleague of mine made this nice sort of illustration saying, this is what fossil fuel generators providing frequency response look like. And this is what a battery doing it looks like. It's simply the amount of digital technology that's built into the modern battery and the ability to communicate with the grid and react that much faster and more efficiently that makes batteries potentially a much better solution to addressing this type of issue. Now, of course, that's all well and good, but if batteries cost a fortune, who cares, right? But the reality is that battery prices have also, like I've showed with photovoltaic equipment earlier, those prices for batteries have also been declining. We do a survey every year of buyers and sellers of lithium-ion batteries around the world. I would argue that it's actually one of the hardest things that we do, because the market is now moving so quickly that every time we put out a new number, we get feedback that our number is too high. But even with that, we've seen the price of a lithium-ion battery drop by about 80% since 2010, down to about $200 per kilowatt hour. This is not, frankly, because of any kind of great technological breakthrough. Again, it's just economies of scale that have driven this. And again, it's a story of China and the amount of capacity that they've been adding that has driven these prices down. So of course, then the question is, when do you get to a point where you're actually going to be driving some kind of change in the market? And that brings me to electric vehicles. So, as I said, battery prices down about 80%. We try to forecast out how much they're going to decline in the future. We certainly don't assume that the rate of decline that we've seen over the last 7 to 10 years is the same rate of decline that we're going to see going forward. We assume a much more modest learning rate, which you see plotted out to the right-hand side there in that first chart as you look through 2030. So then the question is, as batteries matter, right now, a huge portion of the cost of any electric vehicle is the battery. To a large degree, the rest of it is, those costs are relatively fixed. I know there's a lot of work that's going on around the materials that go on the car and other things like that. But it's the battery where you can make the biggest impact on making electric vehicles actually cost competitive for consumers. And I would note that right now they're not for most consumers. Even with the declines in the prices, in most markets, if you don't have some kind of a subsidy available, you won't buy an electric vehicle. You get $7,500 at the federal level in the United States. I know Canada has credits as well. It helps to offset that cost differential. So the question is, when do you get to some kind of crossover point? Our view is it's probably sometime into the mid-next decade where you get this point where consumers will buy EVs purely on an economic basis without the benefit of subsidies. This could certainly happen sooner. And as I also mentioned, given that what I think is a superior product in terms of the consumer experience, that also might push things up sooner. The fact that oil prices are now back up up to $70, and we did this analysis with oil price at about 50, suggests that that also might move it sooner. So this all could accelerate quite a bit, but this is our general view on the long term. And what that then gets us to in terms of our long-term view about electric vehicle adoption and light-duty vehicles is that a bit over half the cars that get sold by 2040 we think will be electric vehicles. And about a third of the cars that are on the road by then will be electric vehicles. That's a pretty considerable number. And when we first put out that forecast a couple of years ago, not surprisingly, we took some amount of flack and people thought that that was kind of nuts. But I would say that the perceptions about electric vehicles are changing very quickly. And whether everyone's right or wrong, I don't know. But the perceptions, at least, are changing. I point this out. This was The Economist cover from last year. Roadkill, that's a picture, I guess, of an internal combustion engine dead on its back. The other thing, BP says that they could see EV demand crimping oil demand, EV demand impacting oil demand by 2040. And the Shell CEO says his next car will be electric. None of this is quantitative stuff, but the point is we are increasingly seeing some kind of an acknowledgement or an assessment that EVs are going to be an important part of the future. And to paint that sort of in black and white a little bit more, and again, apologies to those in the back, but every year we've now for 3 years done this outlook looking at electric vehicles year on year. And maybe I can use this for a sec. Let's see if this worked. So maybe not. Yeah. So those top 3 lines, those are the BNEF forecasts that we've done for each of the 3 years. And we keep getting more bullish about how many EVs we think are going to get sold by 2040. We keep raising our number. Well, so what? Who cares, right? More interesting to me is the fact that if you look down below are the forecasts from the EIA, from ExxonMobil, from BP, from even OPEC. And each of them it's a tangle of lines in the short run, but each of them, as they've redone their forecasts, have been raising their numbers as well. So again, it's not that we're necessarily right and they're wrong, who knows, 2040 is a long time from now, but the fact of the matter is there is a growing view that electric vehicles are going to be an important part of our lives going forward into the future. So I've talked about EVs, though, purely in the context of cars. But of course, there's a whole other very important segment of the market, which frankly we didn't focus on the first year we did this analysis, but we do now. This is just a picture of a parking lot outside the BYD headquarters, I don't know the headquarters, but a BYD office in Shenzhen, China. And those are electric buses over there. China, the progress that China has made on electric buses is incredible, and in the grand scheme of things, I would argue is a little bit under the radar. About 400,000 electric buses were sold last year in China, or I should say are on the road in China as of the year end last year. To put that a little bit in context, there's about 3 to 3.5 million total municipal buses around the world. So we're talking about 12% already of municipal buses globally are electric buses. And China, I mean, I put on, there's a little sliver at the top of that for sort of the rest of the world in terms of demand for electric buses, but it's infinitesimal comparatively. And just as a side note, the question is, does this matter to the oil and gas industry? I would say, obviously, yeah, it does. By our calculation, potentially already the municipal bus fleet in China has reduced what could be diesel demand by about 10%. That's not an insignificant amount when you think about global demand overall. We also think that the electric bus market diversifies going forward. It's been a China story so far. China has had certain policies and certain efforts and support for BYD and others to build these buses, but over time you're going to start to see other markets get involved as well. You can see Europe, the rest of the world, others coming along as well. And eventually our view is that you get to somewhere around 80% of the market being municipal buses by 2040. And as that happens, obviously there are real implications for demand. The other thing to point out about EVs and about e-buses is that it really does matter in terms of demand for electricity. One chart that I haven't shown here is that most utility companies, if they're really honest with you in wealthy countries, will acknowledge the fact that the demand for their product on a day-to-day basis is not growing. We've seen not spectacular, but decent economic growth over the last 5 years in the United States, and demand for electricity has barely budged. And that's a trend that we see across Europe and Canada and elsewhere. Demand for electrons under the current circumstances, in our view, in OECD countries, will actually decline longer term if you do not do something, if you don't create some new source of demand. And so one of the things that we find very interesting about this is that this could potentially create up to 2,000 terawatt hours per year of new electricity demand around the world from different markets. China, a big part of the story, but not the only part of the story. And just to go back to those utilities for a second, this doesn't, in our view, take you from being sort of negative into positive territory. This probably takes you from negative to a good deal less negative, but still probably pretty flat to negative in terms of growth in demand for electricity for most utilities. In terms of displacement, there are a variety of different products, of oil products that our view will be displaced ultimately, in the long run by the advent of both buses and by electric vehicles. Ultimately, OPEC is forecasting that by 2040 you'll be at 112 million barrels per day of demand. We don't try to, frankly, forecast overall oil demand. We are going to actually get into that business in a year or two, but it's not something that we know a ton about. But we're talking potentially about 7 million barrels per day of reduced demand that's created by adoption of e-buses and electric vehicles. So I guess off the top of my head, that's about a 5% difference in terms of the total. And then on the right-hand side, just where that sort of delta comes from, who's doing the subtracting In the short run, it's China, and that's driven by the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, the reduced demand for diesel that's created by e-buses currently, but over time it becomes more diverse. And that's really because of the proliferation of light-duty vehicles that are EVs over time, and the e-bus is playing a smaller role on a proportional basis overall. All right, so I'm going to finish up in just a second, but actually, do a glass of water, Dave, if you don't mind. One last point I just would like to make just quickly before closing out is that, I've painted for you a world that is more optimistic in our one sort of fundamental case than you get from the EIA, from the IEA, certainly from the BP outlook or the ExxonMobil outlook. And I would also note that the forecasts that I've showed you don't make any assumptions about great kumbaya moments around climate change. We don't assume that countries are doing more than they've already pledged today. So yeah, there's the Paris Agreement, that's wonderful. But we don't care unless that country went back home, passed binding legislation that said, we're going to do X, we're going to do Y, and we're going to do Z. And that's the only point that it enters into our long-term forecast. And frankly, if X, Y, or Z has a date where it's supposed to sunset, then we assume it sunsets, so it never comes back. So the US, for instance, we have tax credits. They're expiring over the next couple of years. We don't assume Congress gets its act together, passes them again. We assume they're done. So it's generally an economically driven forecast in which we make very little assumptions. But if you do have a policy on your books, it does make a difference. And so I did actually want to mention for one second Canada for a moment. The kind of critical inflection point, there are really two critical inflection points in our view in any power market, going back to power for just a second, which is the point at which building a new project of one technology is cheaper than building a new project of another technology. So if you're in a growing market, you need to add a gigawatt of capacity, what's the cheapest way to do it? That's that question. That's actually not that relevant a question in Canada, where your demand for electricity is not growing in a major way. It's more about replacing stuff that you've got. So what's the point at which new power generation can, on an economic basis, undercut existing generation? And so we call that tipping point number 2 in our long-range outlook. And this jumble of lines that you see around 2018 kind of shows you our current levelized cost of electricity estimate for different technologies. The blue range is the range of costs around wind. The yellow is the range around solar. The black is what operating coal is at by our estimate, and then the gray is gas. And you can notice how that line does little step-ups on the coal side and on the gas side year on year. And what that is our perceived potential rollout of the carbon price. And that's what causes this crossover, this point where you would see into the next decade where essentially wind and solar would be able to undercut fossil generation on cost. If you don't add those costs on there, those lines don't cross nearly so soon. They would probably cross eventually, but they don't happen at nearly the same pace. So obviously, stating the obvious, but policy matters, obviously, in this context in terms of how you might or might not see a transition in the Canadian context. As I mentioned already, the Canadian power sector, incredibly low carbon thanks to large hydro at the moment. In our view, longer term, again, presuming that the carbon price stays, you do see a phase out of coal. As you know, Alberta's made a commitment. This is where a big portion of that coal already is. And you still see a role for gas going forward, but diminishing. And on the right side are CO2 emissions from the power sector, which we do see certainly declining over time. Again, just the power sector, just domestically, and as you all know, the power sector is not very emissions intensive in Canada. So finally, I'm going to finish up by just making one last point in terms of this all not being enough if you care about climate change. Our view in the long run, as I mentioned, is that we think you see this incredible transformation of the power sector over the next 20, 25 years. We think you'll see more than a total doubling of installed capacity, that's the left to the right side, from about 7,000 gigawatts to about 17,000 gigawatts. A huge increase in terms of the amount of capacity that's online around the world. Without getting into too much detail, there's little pink chunks that you see we call flexible capacity. That's batteries, that's demand response. That's even natural gas peaker plants that'll help to address those issues. But you get to a world where about half your installed capacity is wind or solar. I would also make one note that I mentioned earlier is just because capacity doubles doesn't mean that generation doubles. In fact, the generation will probably rise, but at a much more modest pace. But these are lower capacity factors, these wind and solar projects, so you have to add a lot more of them because they operate at a lower rate. So that's sort of the general long-term view. It is a much more optimistic view about clean energy than many others have. But still, if you think about it in the context of climate change, it doesn't reduce CO2 emissions nearly enough for the power sector to make its contributions to avoiding a 2-degree world. So the core view that we have up at the top is what we call NEO. That's our New Energy Outlook view in blue. And you can see the emissions essentially are arrested and do decline in our core view looking forward. But that bottom line, which is the green line, that's how much you'd need to cut emissions from the power sector if you want the power sector to make a meaningful and justifiable contribution to reducing CO2 emissions. There's got to be cuts, to be clear, from the transportation industry, other things as well. But for the power sector to make its share of contribution, that's how much you need emissions to decline. And then the middle, just because we were curious, we thought, okay, what happens if you said, let's close down all the coal plants in the world from 2025 to 2035? How does that help you in terms of emissions? And that's that purple line. And the short answer is, yeah, it would certainly reduce emissions a lot from the power sector, but it would not get you all the way down to that bottom line. There's still a big gap to goal. And so the bottom line is, in the US particular, we hear a lot about gas as a transition fuel or gas as the long-term. Certainly gas has half the emissions of coal. But if you just replace a lot of coal with a lot of gas, you don't get to the bottom line. So there is an opportunity certainly there, but if policymakers and others want to hit that bottom line, you can't just do it under the kind of outlook that I'm talking about. You do need additional policy. So with that, I'll just say thanks so much to David and everybody, and I'm happy to take questions.
Hi, Ethan. Thank you for your talk. My name is Amy Zell. I'm an engineer at Blue Source Canada. You touched on it briefly, but there's many mixed messages about carbon pricing. In your opinion, do you think that's an effective way to incentivize a transition to renewables? And if so, at what price?
The short answer is, look, I think carbon pricing has been proven that it can be the most flexible policy tool for creating meaningful change towards reaching a lower carbon goal. There are multiple political goals that politicians often try to achieve through clean energy. Creating jobs, adding capacity, being able to show up in front of a wind farm and cut a ribbon, and all kinds of other things. It's not necessarily that a carbon price is the one tool that gets you the most new clean energy power generating capacity in photo ops, but it is the best possible tool for actually focusing on CO2 emissions reduction. Do I have an opinion about exactly what that price should be in the Canada context? No, I do not.
Hi, good morning. I was just curious for your forecast of emissions. Was that life cycle assessment, so production of the technology to be renewable, or is it just the use of the tool to burn the energy? It
is smokestack emissions from power plants versus no smokestack from, so it's not life cycle. No, we're not taking into account whatever emissions might be associated with, say, the manufacturing of photovoltaic equipment. Just like we're not comparing it against the life cycle emissions of oil extraction or gas extraction, for that matter.
I was just wondering, at the beginning you mentioned distribution. Most of the talk was about generation. What's the impact of distribution, particularly in the context of the way our neighborhoods are typically wired?
Really good question. You're right. A whole other talk could be given about distribution. To my mind, well, there's two angles. One, there is the technical question, which is, what if you plug, 10 Teslas into 1 square block, what are the implications for the grid? And there have been some real questions around that in some neighborhoods in California already. So the technical question about whether or not we're ready everywhere to go electric in terms of that type of demand is a bit of an open one at this point. I think the more interesting question around distribution, though, is the economic question, which is if you talk about a country like Australia, 1 in 5 roofs, residential roofs, have PV on it, and you look at markets where we're predicting you're going to have some markets where as much as half the power is going to be decentralized, meaning people are getting it locally off their roof. Well, there's still a grid, and there's still a whole infrastructure that's required to deliver that other half the power to people's houses, and how does that get paid for? And that's a question that utilities increasingly in the U.S. context and other places around the world are certainly raising and are pushing back on policies like net metering that allow people who have solar systems on their roof to sell the power back into their grid. And I think it's a very open question. I will say this, though, which is that we do see a lot of pushback and a lot of resistance from utilities to decentralized energy and to local PV. And they'll fight that through policy in a number of cases, but ultimately it won't matter. If the consumer can do this stuff cheap enough, they'll do it. If at some point they reach the conclusion in 2028 or 2029 that a PV system plus the battery is actually just cheaper than buying power from their utility, they'll do that. And so that will put pressure on utilities regardless.
Your point about the reduction in cost of the battery was impressive, the lithium-ion battery. Do you see as the availability or price of lithium being a limiting factor to the adoption of that technology? And if so, are you seeing other technologies come out in that area?
It's a good question about, and the short answer is, in the short run, is no. We've not seen what we consider to be, there have been changes, certainly changes in lithium pricing, but not in the short run. In the long run, yeah, to meet that picture that I showed, if all those vehicles are going to be all kitted out with lithium-ion batteries, you're going to need additional lithium extraction in different mines around the world. And that's not the only material, which is really important as well. So there will be pressure on the supply chain going forward in terms of extraction, and probably have to find some new places to get some of these materials. A lot of it comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is not an easy place to do business, and let's just say labor standards are not great there either. So there's a lot that's going to have to be done upstream to accommodate all of that going forward. Just one other note about lithium-ion batteries is that it's not necessarily that lithium-ion batteries are the best technology for everything, but they're the technology that's by far received the most investment to date. And the one thing we try to do when we do these forecasts and these long-term views is not try to make any bets about technologies that either don't exist or are waiting for big price breakthroughs. So yeah, there's a lot of other great technologies out there that are being developed, and we certainly think that it's possible that there can be a breakthrough. But we have seen an actual demonstrable learning rate with lithium-ion, and we can see the amount of factories that are online to make more of this stuff in China, so we can at least do those price forecasts that we're pretty comfortable with.